Well, hello everybody, watching either now or in the future. As you know, I'm Philip Meredith, a contributor, and yet again, twice in 1 week, it's my great pleasure to introduce you again to Harry Atherton, with whom I thoroughly enjoy a natter. His views are insightful, based on lifelong experience of much of the world. So, good morning, Harry.
Good morning, Philip. Good morning, everybody.
Um, Harry, the country in which you live, uh, the most recent news is that a very well respected and dedicated educationalist for over 45 years, who at the time of his forced resignation was the principal of the Maurice Ravel Lycée in Paris,
hmm
um, has quit his job because of Islamic death threats, because he followed the law in France and told three female students to remove their headwear. As I understand it, two of them did, but a third refused, and then made up some cock and bull story that this principal had assaulted her. And according to the British news, she is now at risk of being sued herself for fabricating such an allegation. But at the end of the day, the French education system has lost a very good person. Would you agree?
I'm sure they have lost a good person. I don't know the person, and in fact, he remains anonymous. They haven't released
Yes.
his name, but he's had a very distinguished career, and I think he only had about 7 months to go before he formally retired. But he felt sufficiently threatened to decide himself to pull the pin ahead of time. And to camouflage their embarrassment, the school authorities have said, "Okay, we're giving him, anticipated retirement. I don't know how do you say that in English, par anticipation, uh, uh, accelerated retirement, what have you."
Yes, yes.
Um, and and so he'll get his full pension, and he'll probably fade into history. But I think that what we need to do is to understand a little bit of a background as to how this sort of situation exists in France, um, in almost as a relic of all the political upheavals which happened throughout the 19th century in France, which was spawned by the French Revolution in 1789. France was still trying to get its act together, and in 1905, they finally tried to put the lid on the whole question of religion. They passed a law which made France a lay state. There had previously been a national religion. At the time of the revolution, the church, which had helped foment in many ways the revolution, was the baby that was thrown out with the bathwater.
Yes.
And unfortunately, many religious people were executed. The whole nunnery of nuns and the Mother Superior, they were all guillotined, and terrible business that they went through. But they were still trying to find themselves and establish their values in relation to their religion until 1905, when in 1905 they passed this act, that on any ostentatious sign of a religion is forbidden. There is no state religion; it's a lay state. Now, this was aimed obviously at the Catholic Church, but now with this enormous resurgence of Islamism in France, which is I think, the Western country with the highest proportion of practicing Muslims. It's become quite a bone of contention, and it's held up by many of the Muslim authorities as they seek to encroach on public life. So when the when the headmaster was simply applying the law, which a more recent law, that one, mind you, 2004, which forbid ostentation of religious symbols in schools, in academic institutions, and he was simply enforcing that law. He told the three girls in question to remove their headscarves, typical religious headscarves, not just headscarves like any woman would wear. And two of them agreed, and the third one refused. A rather an unusual case is she's already a young woman. I believe at the time she was turned 18 already, so she'd be something of a mature student, and
Yes.
obviously a very reactionary kind of person. And she claimed that he then got very excited, shouted at her, and hit her quite hard on the arm. But there's been no proof of that, and she withdrew that comment, and so she is now being accused and is going to be pursued by the French state, by the French judiciary, for giving false evidence. So it will be false testimony that she's accused of. It will not necessarily dig into the whole question of why the question you've raised is why should this worthy servant of the state have his career truncated in the final months of his tenure? And so it'll all be a technical question of did he strike her? The answer is pretty sure at the moment that he did not. Otherwise, the state wouldn't be taking the risk of prosecuting her. And so she'll be prosecuted, as I say, for having given false testimony, and that will further cloud the issue. Further background is the fact that since 2012, some 260, 262 is a figure that comes to mind. People have been killed in France, murdered by
Yes.
extremist movements. Not the least the famous Bataclan massacre, where they machine gunned innocent bystanders having a glass of wine on the terrace in Paris. But we've even had one teacher was Samuel Paty was
He was beheaded.
decapitated, yeah,
Yeah.
beheaded, and another one was stabbed to death. So there's quite a history of this. So I can quite understand this unnamed headmaster wanting to, go into some sort of peaceful retirement. But it does indicate the incredible power that not only does the Islamic movement have in France, but the extension of that power by the modern social networks like TikTok and others that are less selective in what they allow to go on the screens. And all of the kids have got these, and lots of adults too. And there is a move. There is a move in certain parts of the world, in the States, for instance, to ban TikTok. Um,
Yes. Well,
for that reason.
absolutely.
And so, at the moment in the States, they're looking at purchasing the American branch of TikTok from its Chinese parent company as a means of bringing it under the aegis of the normal rules and regulations that apply to social media. We give it a little bit more control, not state control, but moral control, value control, rules that prevent them being used as an instrument of creating trouble. But that's not the case. It's very free in France. It's they can say and do what they like, and nobody seems to get prosecuted for it. The regular television stations are very tightly controlled by the government. There's a very much of a controlled press in France. But the social media, no, they're given pretty much free reign. So, in many ways, we put ourselves in this position. If we were faced with the threat that this poor gentleman faced, would we be brave enough to wait until we were decapitated in the street? which is
Well,
what.
I can be perfectly honest with you. I am a total coward anyway, and I would not wait.
Well, I
I,
think most people would agree with you and why should we personally pay the price for the failure of our leaders? But then again, what we have in the Western world at the moment, generally speaking, is a dearth of decent leadership. Just before the program came on, you and I were chatting about the fact that.
well, we were, and I'd like to expand on that in a
Mhm.
second.
Mhm.
The British media are suggesting that a lot of this Islamophile social media stuff is actually Russian disinformation. I don't know whether the French media have suggested such a thing, but it is believed over here that it's not all genuine and it is Russia up to its tricks. Is that a suggestion that's been made over with you?
I believe that to be true. I would extend it to China as well and other
Of course.
nations that do not have our interests at heart. And I'm sure that they're putting a lot of effort and information into this kind of program to destabilize Western society. They wars are won by not so much by guns and bullets, but by changing people's minds. So I quite believe it's true that there's a lot of foreign interference. We've just recently had proof of massive Chinese interference in Britain, cyber interference, and the British government, useless as they are, have done nothing about it. They've closed down one small Chinese company and they've thrown out a couple of minor Chinese officials. They should have thrown out the ambassador. They should. You don't lie down before.
Well, that's what they should have done.
Mhm.
But as is your view, and who can disagree with you, they're too lily-livered.
Absolutely, they're scared of their own
Um,
shadow.
I mean, I remember a story years ago that I read about that horrified me, whereby a British ambassador was called to in China, was summoned to the Chinese authorities, and was effectively humiliated in that he was asked to stand and bow. And when eventually, through an interpreter, he said, "Why was I made to do that?" And they all sort of laughed and said, "Well, we wanted to know that you meant it."
Mm.
And that apparently was a true story.
Yeah, yeah.
They have absolutely zilch respect
Hmm.
because they don't respect the weak
Absolutely.
and they don't respect democracy.
Hmm.
I mean, only 10 days ago, and it's still on the Mirador Library, Keith, who's now joined us, did an early morning program on Russian cyber attacks. And, you know, they are targeting the Western world. However, sorry, I'm distracted by an arrival at the front door, which hopefully my wife will get. But I don't know. We'll see. She's not that keen on answering front doors.
Mm.
But no, now, on a lighter note for a few minutes, Harry, the last time we spoke.
I wonder if I just could have one quick word before we leave this topic. Kosovo, where I was the media supremo for 2.5 years, is 98% Muslim. It's got many, many problems. But one thing that the authorities did was that they banned any form of Islamic clothing, no burqas, no nothing, in schools. The children went to school in ordinary clothes. So it is not, although it's a small country and it's not without its problems, it is possible.
No, it's a very good point that Keith
That
makes.
is an extremely good point, Keith.
Mhm.
An extremely good point.
Right, and I believe that there's a distinction definitely between Islamism and the Islamic religion. one is it's almost as if Islamism is hijacking the religion for political purposes,
Yes.
and
It's,
so
yes. It's the
and
old
then,
argument between extremism and moderates.
indeed, and using it as as an instrument. We've seen in history of extreme use of Christian religions where people have gone to
Yes.
excesses.
This is the point, you
Once,
know.
once you have a religion which controls people's minds, it's great similarity between a religion and an ideology that it's very easily distorted. And
Yes.
if the so-called values of those religions are conflictual, if you have, for instance, in the Christian religion, a religion based on peace, on turning the other cheek, whereas, except in the Old Testament, you were supposed to smite your enemies and do all sorts of terrible things to them. The other religions that are dominating the world at the moment, not Islam, is a religion which declares itself a religion of peace, but seeks to achieve them by some rather extreme means.
Yes. Quite.
So you get a confliction of ideologies, but it's no different from the conflict between I don't know, socialism and conservatism in many ways. It's where your mind is at, where your heart is at in some ways. But it controls the mind and makes you do extreme things. And if those religions get hijacked, if ideologies get hijacked, I mean, can you imagine a better system than the world than communism, where true communism, where the wealth is shared, generated collectively and shared, and there's equality. But we saw in Russia at the early part of the 20th century how that ideology was immediately hijacked by the extremists and the
Right, the Bolsheviks, yes, the
the
Soviets.
Kerenskys were chased out, and the Lenins and the Stalins took their place. So it's very easy to, once you see a force, to hijack that force and use it for your own political purposes and fulfill your own ambitions. Look at what's happening in most of the totalitarian states in the world right now. We have examples of that. But on the other side of the coin, we've got we have situation in Britain where there is a complete void of leadership. You've got bright enough people, I suppose. Rishi Sunak is pretty bright. He's not more educated than I am, and Keir Starmer, as you mentioned, was a successful lawyer and what have you. But I mean, they couldn't. Trying to think of a polite way of saying this, but it's
well. How about IQ doesn't mean EQ?
Hmm?
IQ does not mean world experience. Education should include the University of Life, as a very successful businessman friend of mine says, who happens to be a Yorkshireman from Bradford.
Oh, really?
No, we'll come on, if we may, in a wider span to that subject. But on a briefly lighter note, when we last spoke, Harry, you told whoever's prepared to listen and watch that you have pride in being British, but you have particular pride in being from Yorkshire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as a mellow, generous, sensitive Lancastrian, I have a problem with that. I have a problem with that because Yorkshire people generally have a certain stereotype. I sent you a link, whether you bothered watching it, but I sent you a link, a comedy sketch by Harry Enfield.
Yes, I saw that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is the stereotype, isn't it?
It is, but I think it's rather forced. I do hope that Yorkshire people are not quite like that. the fish and chips image of this awful person. I hadn't seen that. I hadn't seen him before. I take it that he's a very successful comedian, and
Yes, well, he has been extremely successful. He's effectively retired now because the PC Brigade got him. He used to do some incredibly funny sketches, not just about a Yorkshireman, but he used to do a fabulous comedy bit about a Greek bistro where the proprietor was called Stavros. And he would do this because he's from North London. I mean, this is all like genuine comedy. This is all from their background. And he did another one about, Eastern Europeans running coffee shops. He did a character in the 80s called Loads of Money, the Thatcherite, Loads of Money. And then he did another one based on a lad from Newcastle who, whatever the weather, would always be in T-shirt and shorts with a packet of fags up his sleeve.
Sure,
and he was called Bugger All Money. So, I mean, these are really funny, I thought, but the PC Brigade have got rid of that now.
Sure. Well, I can see that. Well, as I say, I'd never seen him before, but it's a stereotypal representation of a Yorkshireman. But going back to what you said at the beginning here, is Yorkshire, Lancashire, is it not a pride of origin that we, to a degree, wear on our sleeve? We support our local cricket team, or we support whatever we feel is our culture. But when push comes to shove, we all pile in and we become
it's
one nation.
Yes, it's in a parochial way. It's similar to the English and the Australians. They'll knock lumps out of each other at cricket or whatever else, but they'll be in each other's dressing room at the end of the game. It's the same with the Lankies and the Yorkies. Of course, there's a rivalry there. People need to identify. It's very basic tribal identification. And mercifully, it's different from the football type of identification because cricket is a very different game. Very different game. But of course, when the chips are down, you forget what county you're from.
Well, of course, it's very difficult. We talk about Yorkshire, Lancashire. When does that really come into being? I suppose if we wanted to give it a date, we might as well choose 1485.
Well, yes, quite.
Battle of Bosworth and the triumph of the House of Lancaster over the House of York, Richard III's demise. Poor guy, much maligned.
But pause there if you would. Did you not see? And if you haven't got it, I'll somehow get it to you. This wonderful program about how his remains were found.
Oh yes, I have seen that. Yeah,
in a car park.
In the Safeway car.
Correct. And how certainly his head was completely recreated as to how he would have looked.
Yes, I have seen that.
And then moving on to his funeral service, he was buried as a King of England by, I know you're not a fan, but by Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Right, yeah.
Very moving program.
Well, no, and I have seen quite a few reports on that, and I'm so impressed that it was a lady archaeologist, I believe.
It was a lady archaeologist, yeah.
How on earth did she calculate to within a few meters as to where the body would be found?
Well, it was based on local gossip. And in that very car park, before they even began to dig, was the letter R and the number 3. And that had been there for years. nobody quite believed it. But I mean, to watch, all right, it was a recording, but to watch live as a recording when they found the bones was quite extraordinary. I love history, and I will confess to you now, the hairs on my neck stood up when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
When they actually found that skeleton, and then they laid it out in the laboratory,
Mm-hmm.
and it showed the curvature of the spine.
Mm-hmm.
Quite extraordinary.
Sure.
Absolute blinder of a program.
And within so accurately placed. I mean, I believe where they started digging, and they finally found it only like 2 or 3 meters away.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were about to give up.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them, not the lady who ran the whole show, but one of the diggers
Mm-hmm.
and scrapers eventually found a piece of bone that she said was human.
Mm-hmm.
So they carried on. But they were within minutes of giving up.
Yeah. No, it's a great story. So now fill me in on that one. Where is Richard? Is Richard buried in Westminster now, or where?
No. He's buried in one of the Midlands cathedrals.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I can just look that up quickly. No, they buried him not in Westminster. There's a very special mausoleum and grave that was created for him.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've agreed, I think it's Leicester Cathedral, but I could be wrong.
Well, that sounds right. That sounds as it could be. Logically, it would be because that would be the closest major religious site to where he died, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pausing because let's say it's Leicester Cathedral, and I will correct that. I've got this feeling it went somewhere else, but I think it was Leicester, and there's a very specific grave and memorial to him. Frankly, better than any other modern royal grave.
Sure.
Could it be Lichfield Cathedral?
It could be, Keith. I'll look that up later. Anyway, but it's not Westminster Abbey. So yes, back to 1485, Henry VII, and we take it from there. Wars of the Roses, Red Rose Lancashire, White Rose Yorkshire, and so on. I mean, there is a superb BBC production, not that old, of the play Richard III with Benedict Cumberbatch in, where he plays Richard III. And it is entirely based on the Shakespeare narrative. And it's the most wonderful, wonderful program. But they were brutal times.
And they were. And even if you go back in time to Danelaw and the fact that most of that section of England was occupied by the Vikings or people who had come from Scandinavia. So
the northeast. You know, to this day, they reckon the so-called Geordie accent is a legacy of the Viking way of speaking.
Indeed, it is, and which is, and not just the accent, the way that the sound is produced in the mouth.
Yes.
I'd looked into this a few years ago, and from what I remember, sound can only be produced in 5 different ways in the mouth. See if I can remember them. You can. The first way of producing sound is called bilabial, where you produce this between the lips. You produce a sound like B or P, and then you've got labiodental, which is the tongue and the inside of the teeth, which would give you a D, like for dog. And then you've got the labioglottal, is it? Where the tongue goes
Yeah.
against the roof of the mouth.
Yes.
There's
Yeah.
one where the tongue goes against the back of the mouth, and the fifth one is known as the glottal stop. The
Yes.
glottal stop, which is where you get a g or what have you.
That's
Now,
the only one. That's the only one I knew.
now languages have got to come from those 5 particular sources of sound, or and not the grammar of the language, but the sound of the language. And different languages are produced by majority terms in different parts of the mouth. German is a guttural language produced towards the back of the mouth.
Yep.
And Geordie is a guttural language produced to the back of the mouth, which explained why during the war, Geordies were very often trained as to their ears were made them more able to learn German and understand German to intercept German messages during the war.
How interesting.
Because the natural sounds were natural to them.
Yes.
The French language, by contrast, is produced largely at the front of the mouth.
It certainly is.
Which, when you see a Frenchman talking on television, or you see a lot of movement of the mouth at the front of the mouth. There's this avantage, and they're bringing out sounds that come from the front of the mouth. So
we had a French teacher at my grammar school, very old school, forgive the pun, but he would train us to make the sounds of the French language.
Yeah.
By literally shaping the front of our mouths.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And whether we used our hand, our finger, another instrument, or just did what he showed us, everything was at the front of the mouth.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And of course, this explains at the same time why, if from childhood, you've used the muscles in a particular part of the mouth to produce sound, and now you're asking those same muscles to produce the sound of another language.
Quite.
If you're French, you will always speak English with a French accent.
Quite so.
Because you're using French muscles to produce an English sound.
Yes.
And if you were German speaking English, you would produce English with German trained muscles, and you'd always sound like a German speaking English. It's a fairly procedure to follow.
My wife, who, like me, went to Durham University, more or less at the same time, but we didn't know each other at the time, is a diehard North London, well-off Londoner. And when she went to the Northeast, unusually, I had no problem understanding them at all. At all. Gosh, she struggled. She needed subtitles. She needed a dictionary. And it was the same when my younger brother got married, of all places, in Gretna Green, for quite legal reasons. And we went up to the wedding and we flew through Glasgow. And we had to get from the airport to the railway station. And classic Glaswegian cab driver, no different from a London one, but speaking to my wife incomprehensible Scottish.
Yes.
Hadn't the foggiest. I understood, thankfully, I understood every word. But that was pure chance.
God, yeah.
You know. But the joke I wanted to tell you, which I was reminded of about the Yorkshire thing, was a congregationer from here in Sussex went into the local parish church one Sunday, and at the back of the church in a cubicle was a telephone, a bog standard, old-fashioned metal, silver metal, coin-fed telephone, and above it was a sign saying "Direct line to God, international rate supply."
Yeah.
So he went to the priest after the service. Said, "Is this true?" Yeah, yes," said the priest. But you're going to need lots of money because it's a very, very expensive process. Anyway, he went on holiday to Yorkshire.
Yes.
And he attended a service near where he was staying in Yorkshire. And he goes in the church, and there's a similar cubicle, but it's a different phone. It's just a standard lift-off phone made of brass. And there's no signage. So he goes through the service, and he hooks up the vicar at the end. They said, "We've got something similar than that down south, but we have to pay for it with our own money, and it's very expensive." And the vicar said, "No, lad, here it's free or local. You're in God's own country."
Right. Yeah. I love it. Yeah. But
I must say that there was a series on BBC called "When the Boats Come In" with James Bowling.
Whoa.
And I thought that I was very, very comfortable. In fact, I thought it was rather beautiful listening to a sort of an hour of Geordie, all spoken between people who were actually speaking to each other in the language.
Yes, but that was very gentle Geordie. Believe me, you can get incomprehensible versions of Geordie.
No, absolutely. Wonderful Geordie folk songs that come to mind. What Geordie's lost his liggy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's When the Boat Comes In. I mean, a group I used to love was Lindisfarne.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The Fog on the Tyne is All Mine.
Mm-hmm.
And the surviving members of that band swear blind that when they put the ashes of that lead singer onto the Tyne, they swear blind that a mist came up above the water briefly and then faded away.
Yeah.
Great stuff, isn't it? Now listen, Monsieur Atherton. Despite the fact you're in Normandy, behind you, I know because I spotted it, is a portrait, a picture of somebody called Winston Churchill.
Indeed, yes. Mm-hmm.
So, on your subject of lack of proper leadership, where do we go from him?
Well, I think it's safe to say that he was a leader, but he was also capable of delegating because he knew that he didn't have all of the answers. And he surrounded himself with the top team who were able to fill in the gaps that he lacked. Where you could make a very reasonable comparison between him and Boris Johnson. They have the charisma, and they have the ideas. They have the inspirational qualities that leadership requires. But whereas he was able to motivate an entire team of varied people, an amazing combination of people, and inspire a whole nation in the process, and without many of the modern facilities to do that. So I feel he's quite a remarkable guy. He was above all a politician. So do you trust politicians? I mean, would you trust Churchill? I mean, he had his ups and downs. He had his detractors. He had his fans. I think he symbolized a great moment in our history. And when I was this particular photograph that I've got of Churchill was taken by Karsh, the Canadian photographer Karsh of Ottawa.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it is an original. It's quite valuable, and it was in an office where I worked in Vancouver for many years, and the office was in an old railway station. And they decided to move everybody out and to different offices and just clear out the station. We could all buy the bits and pieces of furniture that if we wanted. Well, I managed to, for a very small sum, I bought this photograph, original
excellent.
print in Kosh of Ottawa, which is now worth quite a lot of money. But it wasn't, didn't buy it for investment purposes. I just thought it was kind of fun to have, and it. I don't know. It's in my office. If you're looking on the back wall, you probably notice another couple of pictures of.
Well, I'm trying to. My eyes are so bad that I can't.
Well,
Churchill stood out very plainly. I mean, he is unmistakable.
well, over my my right shoulder, so that's left to you. There are two pictures of a gentleman in uniform.
There are two in black and white.
Yeah, two in black and white, and one of them on a horse.
Yes, yes.
A horse with a plume and a sword. Can you see that? A lifeguard.
I can't see that detail, Harry, I'm afraid. No.
Yes, of a lifeguard. I wonder if I could move.
I wonder who that is.
I wonder who that is.
That's you. That's you, isn't it?
Try an experiment here. See if this works.
Is it you?
Yes.
How wonderful.
See if this works here at all. I'm going to lift up my. Is that any better?
Yes, hugely. Can you go nearer? Bare left. Down a bit.
I'll go down a bit more here.
This is a bit like the golden shot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that better?
Oh, how magnificent, Harry.
There we go. Can you see?
Yes, how lovely.
Yes. Well, that's a young man, 19 years old, in the service of Her Majesty.
Yes.
When
I have actually seen that before, Harry.
when I was in the cavalry. As a young man, I not quite sure what to do with life. I decided to join the household cavalry and spent a number of years as a regular soldier.
This is after World War II.
Oh yes, yeah. Actually, after the Boer War, if you want to be precise. But, and
Harry, nothing about you would surprise me or the viewer.
So I spent some happy years in the cavalry. I'd been working out in Spain. I was working as a laborer on the Spanish railway, and in those days you had to do your national service, so you had to stay out of the country until we were 35 to avoid it. Well, that seemed to be terribly old, 35. So I came back, and instead of doing national service, getting into any regiment, I decided to go into a regiment of my choice. And never having ridden a horse, I joined the cavalry and went through very rigorous equitation training at Combermere Barracks in Windsor, and then served a number of years in ceremonial duty at based in Knightsbridge Barracks in Knightsbridge, and I achieved great success. I went in as a private, well, as a trooper, as you're called when you're in the cavalry, and I came out a few years later with the rank of trooper. Deciding that any rank in between wasn't worth holding. You've got to be a private or a general are the only two ranks worth having. And so you
plumped for a trooper.
I chose to be a trooper. So
fair enough, Harry. Fair enough.
Could I just go back to the ways that photographers work, because a friend of mine in Vancouver was a guy called Bill Nellis, and his father was Admiral Nellis, Canada's only ever admiral. And he told me about his father having his photograph taken by Kirsch, and he said the old man was very crusty, and Kirsch would say, do this, and he said in the end, his father lost his rag, and he said, "I've had enough of this," and struggled into his greatcoat and got up, and Kerr snapped and said, "That's it."
Now, I've heard the story of Karsh's photograph of Churchill, and Churchill was trying to look jolly and wanted to be liked by, have a nice picture of a friendly face. But Karsh wanted to capture the bulldog ferocity of Churchill, and he wanted him to frown. And up until that point, Churchill had a cigar in his mouth. Karsh reached forward, took the cigar out of his mouth. Hitler frowned at this insult. Not Hitler, sorry. Churchill frowned at this insult. And that's when he took the picture.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether we can see him. But get my head out of the way there. Yeah.
No, I spotted him the minute we met this morning, Harry.
I don't want to give the impression that I'm a strong supporter of the Conservative Party, because in fact I'm not.
But Churchill wasn't always a Conservative.
No, he wasn't.
He was a Liberal.
Yeah, indeed he was.
And if memory serves me right, when he First Lord of the Admiralty, and he set the Gallipoli disaster into motion, he was then a Liberal member of that government.
Sure, yeah. Well, he began both wars, did he not? As First Lord of the Admiralty. I believe Churchill began the Second World War as First Lord of the Admiralty too.
Well, his ultimate position as leader was almost miraculous, because the Conservative Party, of which he was then a part, led by Chamberlain and Lord Hastings, who was a Nazi file.
Halifax or Hastings?
Sorry, Halifax.
Halifax.
Right.
Yeah.
Halifax. They were whereas the other side of the house, loved Churchill's patriotism and directness, the Conservative Party was still relying on the thumbs up or the heads up from Chamberlain. And if you believe the accuracy of the film His Darkest Hour, it was only after the conclusion of a very rousing speech by Churchill, whereby the other side of the house were in absolute raptures, and the code conduct or sign from Chamberlain was, if he pulled out his starched handkerchief and mopped his brow, then he approved, or at least acquiesced in Churchill.
Yes, yeah.
And that's what he did. And that united everybody in theory. But he had a really hard time, because they were within a whisker of coming to a treaty with Hitler, mediated by, of all people, the bloody Italians,
Sure, yeah.
But mercifully, that didn't happen.
Yes, well, no, that it was, we've got to see politics in the context of their time. And of course, there was the Never Again movement, never again meaning never another slaughter like the First World War. I think they're trying to avoid war at all costs. We're actually going through a similar period now, where we're constantly backing off against the totalitarian states, and in the hope of preserving peace, the so-called peace dividend, which is now expended, but however, that's another story. So history repeats itself, politics repeat themselves, and hopefully, as we talked about earlier, there'll be a decent leader come along, but there's absolutely no sign of any leader in either party at the moment.
There isn't. There isn't.
And as I say, I'm certainly not a fan of the Conservative Party. I strongly espouse conservative principles, but I do not believe that the British Parliamentary Conservative Party would even know what they are. I think they're totally devoid of any conservative thought or principle. They're very, very peculiar bunch. I think the Conservative Parliamentary Conservative Party.
Because they've lost their values.
Yeah,
They've lost their values.
certainly not conservative values.
As you hinted at in our pre-podcast chat, and I think I've understood you. There's so much box ticking going on. You know, they want this sort of jigsaw of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, whatever, and it's all fitting in like a jigsaw. But sadly, it's a very ill-fitting jigsaw. So they are. I wouldn't quite go as far as to say that they're woke, but they're very BBC about the whole thing.
Yeah.
Very BBC, as I would put it. And I would be interested in Keith's view on that comment. That's the way I look at it. It's not quite woke, but it's so PC and so pandering to the minorities that's what we've got. And so there is no cohesion.
Well, all of the institutions at the moment, whether it's the Church of England, the government, or even academia, latest news today, I believe, is that the couple of Alice in Wonderland and another in a major piece of English literature have been given warning signals as being too colonialist or something like that today.
Well, they wouldn't be the first. I mean, the retrospective anti-colonial, anti-imperial, anti-racist effect on literature, portraits, photographs, you name it, is rife. It's rife.
Yeah. Do you feel that will change? Do you feel that is this the end? Are we just going to sink into this morass forever, or will
it'll need a crisis? I mean, I hate to say war, but it'll need some huge crisis that needs first of all bonding and secondly a focus. But you sometimes cannot tell, and you're quite right, there's a difference in policies between right-wing Labour and left-wing Conservative. There is no right-wing Conservative at the moment, bearing in mind that right and left are used in really not in the sort of way that the wokes would have us see. Oh, you're right-wing is a slur. When in fact there's nothing wrong with being right-wing. It's espousing a set of principles.
Sure.
Quite so. And your, Keith, your raising of the issue of a war takes me back to Harry's observations, whether it was last time or the time before that, where he and I were doubting whether you would ever get that spirit of those young enough to fight, to actually fight for the flag, fight for their country. Because as Harry pointed out, they've never had it so good.
Yes. But I also, Philip, remember that some of the bravest soldiers in the Second World War were formerly teddy boys.
Well, you see, actually, even by accident, you have raised the point there. To be a fighting man, you need to be a fighter. You need to have experienced hardship. You need to have had a few fist fights. Because at the end of the day, and I know this from ex-soldiers I've met in my job who I've sadly had to represent with PTSD and all that dreadful stuff. The end of the day, and they've always told me this, you are trained to kill.
Yes.
Let's not pretend. You're not trained to negotiate. You are trained to kill.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line. There's nothing namby-pamby. It's not all about the pomp and the ceremony and the uniforms. They are trained to kill.
Yeah.
That's right. And then afterwards, if something goes wrong, we judge them on standards which are not the ones they've been trained to obey.
Yeah.
Well, look at this business about the alleged atrocities in Afghanistan by British special forces. A level of judgment maybe, but come on, look what they were dealing with.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Well, I get angry at this chasing of people who served in Northern Ireland.
Yes,
I mean,
well,
not only was I in Northern Ireland for 15 years as a journalist, all throughout most of the Troubles, but I was very close to the military, and I know exactly how they think and what they're trained to think and why they think it, and frankly, you ask about the Conservatives, they're a bunch of namby-pamby liberals when it comes to this. They should not be giving in to this sort of thing. If you don't support those people that you assign a job to after they've done it and they've done it effectively, how are you going to get people to do that in the next round?
Absolutely, yeah. But
it's even more simple than that. I come back to Harry's basic point. Where in this country, apart from the current armed forces, which, as I see it, are ridiculously underfunded, the so-called peace dividend, Harry, that you referred to, that's history. But it's left us vulnerable in terms of what percentage of the GNP, or whatever you want to call it, is devoted to our armed forces. I'm probably sound like somebody who reads the Daily Mail now. I don't read the Daily Mail. However, aircraft carriers that can't pull away from the key, nuclear submarines whose missiles flop over the top of the submarine and sink in the bottom of the loch. I mean, come on.
I know.
I just don't see any ground roots will to bond together as we have had to do in the past and face a world conflagration. I just don't think we've got the bottle.
I don't think so either, unfortunately. And if one takes the theory that that life is cyclical, or at least power is cyclical, nations have their moments of supremacy. It looks like our chapter is over.
Harry, let me ask you this as a soldier. There are those in the armed forces and outside the armed forces, for that matter, that argue that any war will always ultimately end up as a ground war with infantry. And there are those that argue that it'll be fought by a very small number of people.
Well, unless you use strategic nuclear weapons, that's probably still the case. But there are those available. And the likes of Putin, I think, would push the button. If he were desperate enough, he would push the button.
I suppose one has to consider that possibility, and as long as we factor that into our decisions, we will never ever resist. We'll always live in fear. So
that's what it is. You as ever summed it up. I mean, speaking personally, I have found this whole business of Ukraine and Russia frankly depressing and quite scary. And I can't be the only one whose mental health it's been affecting. It is a serious worry. And your education of me, Harry, on Monday about the state of German politics, I hadn't the first idea that they were so pro-Eastern or pro-ex-commie, whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
I had absolutely no idea.
Well, the two-thirds of the German ruling class are either Greens or pacifists or what have you.
Yes.
The AfD, which is rising quickly, it still only represents not even a quarter. I wouldn't think. It's so no. It's a nation that will not go to war again in this generation or even the following generation. And if you look at the demise of Nazi Germany, Hitler decided to take the nation down with him. So it's quite feasible that Putin would yet hit the button. So as long as we're frightened of that, but that's because we give too great importance on our own personal well-being. We're only the human race is only on this planet for a very brief moment in time.
Correct.
In
Correct.
its present context, literally, not even 50,000 years, 100,000 years. Humanoids have existed, for many, for millions of years, I suppose. But the human life as we know it is just a very brief moment in history, in the history of the planet. So we're not sacrosanct. We will disappear sooner or later, either with some massive war or with some massive disease or some huge physical change, domination of another species, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Maybe a massive asteroid like the one that killed the dinosaurs.
Absolutely. So why we think of our lives as being so precious, I'm at a loss. Individually, yes, all of us want to survive and see the sun come up in the morning, but we're dreaming in Technicolor, and we don't really merit a permanent role on the planet. We've done enough to mess things up as it is. Probably the place would be better for our absence. But that's taking a rather cynical point of view.
Well, the futuristic films portray a picture of an ultra polluted planet with those humans who have survived living in little bubbles and generally in man-made environments. Now, I personally think that's perfectly feasible. I know you take the very pragmatic view that climate change is a cyclical, inevitable thing going back millions of years.
Absolutely.
But I'm in no doubt that man has and still is contributing to global warming, which worsens climate change. We are still polluting the world.
I don't think there's any question about that. I couldn't agree more. But unless we know what the mathematical effect of the natural anthropological cycle is, we can't calculate how much our contribution is.
No, of course not. But why does it have to be mathematical when, forgive me, it's bloody obvious at the state of Antarctica, for example, that things are going really rather badly with the ice melt, the wildlife, and so on. I mean, obviously, our records don't go back any like as long as the timeline you're talking about. But since the Industrial Revolution, which in many countries even now hasn't ended, like China, you pointed out earlier in the week that they're making a coal-powered fire station
every
week, which I find an extraordinary statistic. But knowing you, it's true. I find it undeniable that mankind in concentrated areas, it's undeniable that mankind is contributing to our demise.
Well, indeed, and but of course, what you hear very little about is the denuding of the Amazon basin, of the Amazon
Well,
rainforests, or the
we
Indonesian
do hear that.
a massive 6,000 acres a day or something silly like that.
It's obscene.
You know, this would be absorbing CO2 if that's the problem. But I don't think it can be measured in polar ice caps, because the oscillations of the Earth as it goes through space and time, because it changes. It's not the constant path through space every year, every decade, every 100 years, every million years. It's changing all the time. And the times when we're presenting the ice caps closer to the sun, and times when we're not. So there are so many factors that come into play, and so many factors that are being ignored. But it's become an ideology, and it's also become a means of making lots of money.
Well,
The money
the
money that's being thrown at climate change at the moment is an economic prize that lots of people are going for. 500,000 scientists worldwide make their living from climate change.
Don't get me wrong.
How many make it from developing a better plastic or a better health pill for old age or something like that? I mean, it's amazing. That's what money is. And don't go into government work if you don't believe in climate change. You're just going to be ostracized.
Yes, I may have misled you to misunderstand me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in no way in agreement with any of that.
Mm-hmm.
And far be it from me to dispute your very wide knowledge about the Earth and the cycles and the climate and whatever. All I'm saying is, from a common sense point of view, whether it's the Chinese with their coal-fired power stations, whether it's the Brazilian tree fellers, it's all short-term human wastage of a wonderful Earth.
Well, of course it is, and I mean, a more recent statistic is that the Chinese at the moment are busy cornering the world copper market.
I think I've read that.
Normally they have a reserve of about 30,000 metric tons of copper. At the moment, they've built their reserve to 10 times that, 300,000 metric tons of copper. Why? Because that copper is going to be one of the essential ingredients. It's an essential ingredient for batteries. We're moving into electric cars, which is the dumbest thing I think that's ever come down the pike, but that's a personal point of view. So who's going to control that market?
Gentlemen, we've actually had fascinating conversations for 1 minute and 8 seconds. 1 hour and 8 minutes, sorry. So I think that we must pick up next week where you've left off. Normally you would be on a Monday, but I'm going to look at the rescheduling to see whether I can get you on again at the beginning of the week, as long as you two are available, because these discussions really are fascinating, but very insightful.
Right, Anchorman, hang on. I'm going to end the stream, but we can all stay on and discuss it, okay?
Yes, I've got other things to do, unfortunately, but you two, by all means, yes.
No. Right, I'm going to end the stream. Can you stay on line?
Yes.
Please?
Well, can we just say to people, we are not on tomorrow. We are not on Monday. We don't broadcast on public holidays, not because we're lazy or we want time off, but because the demographics of viewership changes and we just don't have the resources to change with it. So we won't be broadcasting Friday or Monday, but we will be back next Tuesday and with a full and packed week. So thank you for being with us.
Should I stand by on Tuesday then, Keith? Or
indeed.
Let's discuss. Let me end the stream, Harry, and then we'll discuss that.
Okay, good.